Charles picked up both women, he drove them to a secluded field. It was already dark, so no one could see anything. He pulled out a blanket, laid it down, and asked them both, and both women agreed, so activity started. However, at some point, out of nowhere, Charles violently attacked Veronica. He hit her over the head before her, and then he started viciously beating Veronica as if he wanted to kill her. Veronica was absolutely terrified. She was kicking and screaming, and she did manage to fight back. She managed to get free and she ran off. However, Mary was still there. She was paralyzed with fear. She didn't know what to do, and Charles pulled out a gun, pointed it at Mary, and shot her in the back of the head. And tragically, this is when 33-year-old Mary Pratt lost her life. This is when Charles pulled out his X-Acto knife and started to remove Mary's eyeballs. He started to dissect them from her body, just like he did during his taxidermy. He pushed his knife in before the eye popped out of the socket. He then severed the tissue that was attaching the eyeballs to Mary's head, and he did this with surgical precision. What Charles was doing, he was taking incredibly seriously. It was if it was a work of art to him. He spent almost an hour on this field doing this. And once Charles had finished, he pocketed the eyeballs to keep for his own personal collection. And then Charles dragged Mary's body, placed her body in his car. He drove her right in the middle of a nearby neighborhood, which was a neighborhood near to where Charles lived. Charles then dragged Mary's body from the car out into the street. He removed her pants, lifted up her shirt to expose her breasts, and posed her basically completely nude for anyone to come across and see. And then Charles left, leaving Mary naked in the street. So the next morning, Mary's body was discovered by two teenagers, which would have been incredibly traumatizing for them to find Mary. Meanwhile, Veronica, she obviously fled from Charles, and I don't know if Charles planned on killing both of them that evening, I just don't know. But Veronica went straight to the police because she had fled before Mary had been murdered, so she had no idea what had happened to Mary. She went to the police, she was all frantic, and she started telling her story, but no one believed her. So then back at the scene of the crime where Mary's body has been dumped, obviously police are now on the scene, and those police officers have no idea about the story that Veronica is telling in the police station. Like, they just don't know. So no connection to Charles was ever made. And as well, because the victim, Mary, was a sex worker, police were just like, well, these things happen. This is what you get if you're a sex worker, so who really cares? So yes, they did investigate Mary's murder, but they didn't exactly try too hard. However, by the time we get to the 8th of February 1991, Charles is ready to strike again. Because on this evening, Charles goes back to the Dallas red light district and he picks up a sex worker by the name of Susan Peterson. And Susan was 27 years old, and she was actually one of the sex workers where Charles took back two workers to the motel room and tied them to a bed and viciously attacked them. She was one of those sex workers, so she knew how violent Charles was. However, on this evening, Susan got in the car with Charles and she went with him. And Charles went back to the same secluded field that he had taken Mary and Veronica to. He took out a blanket, he laid it on the floor and asked her to perform on him. And whilst Susan was performing on Charles, Charles took out a gun and shot her in her stomach. This caused Susan to fall backwards in agony, and Charles just stood over her, pointed his gun at her again, and shot her in her chest. At this point, Susan was clinging to life, but Charles wanted to make sure that he got the job done. So this is when he took his gun again and shot her point blank in the head. And tragically, this is when 27-year-old Susan Peterson lost her life. And afterwards, Charles did the exact same thing to Susan that he did to Mary. He spent an hour on that field removing her eyeballs before pocketing them for his personal collection. He then took Susan's body, put her in his car, drove her to the same neighborhood that he dumped Mary's body in, and he posed Susan's body in the exact same way, less than a mile away from where he had posed Mary's body. Her pants were removed, her shirt was lifted up to expose her breasts. This time he also pulled out a clump of her hair and laid it on her chest. Don't really know why he did that or what that means, but it clearly means something to him. And of course, her eyeballs were missing. The next morning, Susan's body was found and it was reported to the police. It was found in broad daylight in the middle of a neighborhood, and I can guarantee you that Charles was loving this attention. And when the police discover Susan's body, there were just way too many similarities to Mary's body. The fact that they were both sex workers, the fact that they were both posed in the same way, the fact that both of them had their eyeballs removed, which is not exactly normal, and the police were like, oh no, we have a serial killer on our hands and we're now actually going to have to investigate these murders of workers. The FBI were brought in because they have more experience with things like this, and they went out and questioned a load of sex workers from the Dallas red light district. Sex workers mentioned Charles Albright, who was this weirdo man who had a violent side that was obsessed with X-Acto knives and eyeballs. But for some strange reason, this information was completely ignored. And I'm like, what? You've literally got multiple people telling you to look into this man. Why the hell are you ignoring it? So for right now, Charles has now gotten away with his second murder. And guess what? Charles just keeps on going. Charles's killing spree would finally come to an end. Because on the 19th of March, 1991, Charles picked up 45-year-old worker Shirley Williams. Now again, we don't really know anything about Shirley's life. However, we do know that she had 2 adult children, an adult daughter and an adult son. And on this evening, Charles picked up Shirley and took her to the nearby field. The same field that he's taken all of his victims to. He laid out a blanket and he asked for... This time, Charles did things slightly different. He demanded Shirley remove all of her clothes before she performed. Even though it was absolutely freezing outside, it was actually raining, which Shirley did. She then started to perform on Charles, but then Charles pulled out his gun and shot Shirley at point blank range in the head. And this is when Shirley Williams lost her life. However, after murdering Shirley, Charles realized that it was nearly morning. The sun was about to come up. Charles had taken too long to choose a victim that night and bring them to the field. Charles was definitely getting reckless. He wasn't following his same routine that he normally did. And normally at this point, after he has murdered a woman, he spends an hour removing their eyeballs. But Charles does not have the luxury of time right now because the sun is about to come up. However, he still needs to feed that need in him to remove Shirley's eyeballs. So without his usual surgical precision, he hacked at Shirley's face to remove her eyeballs. He removed them as fast as he possibly could. However, crucially, what Charles didn't realize was that with his sloppiness, he had left his X-Acto blade in Shirley's cheek. And after he had removed Shirley's eyeballs, he threw her body in the car. He drove her to a different neighborhood because his usual neighborhood that he likes to dump his victims in was too far away, and he didn't have time to travel that far. And then he just dumped Shirley's body on the side of the road, not having time to pose her in his usual way. He still dumped her in a neighborhood though where people would come across her body very quickly, and this is when Charles drove off, hoping that he would get away with murder just one more time. So Shirley's body was discovered very quickly, and even though her body wasn't posed and her eyeballs hadn't been removed with surgical precision, police still knew that it was the work of the same serial killer, because it's not exactly very common that a serial killer removes eyeballs. So the police finally realized that they needed to take this seriously. So they went back to the Dallas red light district and questioned as many sex workers as they possibly could. And one name kept coming up over and over again, and that was Charles Albright. And at around the same time, the police got a visit from Brenda White, who was the victim of Charles, who got the pepper spray out and sprayed it in his face and got away. Well, she came forward after Shirley's murder because she thought that maybe it was the same guy. And because Brenda came forward, she was able to pick out Charles Albright's face in a lineup. So this was finally enough evidence for the police to work with. Also, Veronica was brought back in for questioning. Now, if you remember, Veronica escaped Charles Charles during his first murder of Mary, and she went to the police and they didn't take her seriously. Well, they've now brought Veronica back in for questioning, and they are finally taking Veronica seriously. And because Veronica knew Charles because he was a frequent client of hers, she was also able to pick out his face in a lineup. So the police finally go and arrest Charles Albright. And it's definitely frustrating because if they had just listened to Veronica in the first place, he would have been arrested a long time ago. So they take Charles in for questioning, and of course, he denies everything because Charles thinks that he's going to be able to get away with these murders. On top of that, his wife Dixie came in to defend her husband and gave him an alibi for every single murder and attack. So she's lying to the police. And it really is like Dixie is a reincarnation of Charles's mom, Dell, because Dell came to the defense of her son at every opportune moment. And now Dixie is doing the same thing. What they were really hoping to find were the victim's eyeballs. And because this was Charles's MO to remove the victim's eyeballs, these are clearly his trophies. Police were convinced that he was keeping them in his home, or at least keeping them somewhere. However, the problem is that the police could not find the eyeballs. They searched everywhere, and the eyeballs were nowhere to be seen. The police also searched Charles's car, and this is when they found the blankets that he used to lay down and then have with the workers, and then obviously he murdered them. And on these blankets they found hair and DNA belonging to all three murder victims. So they finally had some evidence linking Charles to the murdered women. And when they got to the field, they found the bloody clothes of Shirley Williams. Charles hadn't had time to clean up the crime scene and get rid of her clothes, and these clothes were also covered in Charles's DNA. So the police thought that this is finally enough evidence to link Charles to the murders. And Charles was charged with 3 counts of murder. So thankfully, Charles Albright was found guilty on the 3rd murder of Shirley Williams, and he was sentenced to life in prison.